IVM.
Journalism in India has become an extremely hazardous profession. It was never easy, but in recent years, journalists are being intimidated, imprisoned, even killed. The Committee to Protect Journalists, headquartered in New York, monitors the safety of journalists worldwide. Our guest today, Robert Mahoney, Deputy Executive Director of CPJ, leads the organization's reporting, editorial, advocacy worldwide. A former journalist with Reuters, Mahoney is familiar with India, having served in New Delhi in the 1980s. Welcome to the Wire Talks, Robert Mahoney.
Thank you so much.
You have a vantage point sitting, a global viewpoint sitting in New York, and you've traveled, you've led teams. What do you think the global scenario for journalists is or was in 2020 in recent times? And has it got worse or better over the years? In what way?
Yes, well, that's the most burning question for us at the moment. Let's leave aside, if we can, for a little while, the pandemic, which has brought its own problems. But even before the coronavirus pandemic, what we have been witnessing is what I would call a creeping authoritarianism. Governments that are seeking to increase their powers, and one of the institutions which acts as a brake on that is the press. So therefore the press has been targeted more and more in countries from authoritarian countries to democracies globally.
So that's something that you've noticed as more or less a secular trend. But you mentioned even democracies. Now, that perhaps introduces a somewhat novel note into the proceedings, because you would expect authoritarian governments to go after the press, but democracies would be a little careful or a little, more relaxed about these things. So how has this happened? And can you give us a couple of examples?
Well, I know we'll come to India in a moment, which is a very important democracy, but let's look at a couple of other democracies around the world where this has happened. Let's take the example of Brazil, which is a potentially very rich country with a democracy. We've seen with the rise of President Jair Bolsonaro an increasing intolerance of the press and of criticism. And Bolsonaro or his cronies have gone after journalists, targeted them individually, tried to introduce repressive legislation simply because they don't want the press to hold them to account. The role of the press in a democracy is to hold those in power responsible and accountable for the exercise of that power. So Brazil is one example where a right-wing government wants to be able to, rule, enrich itself, use the resources of the country without a pesky journalist asking questions. Turkey is another example of a democracy which has become increasingly authoritarian over the last 10 to 15 years. And we can look in Asia at the Philippines, for example, where Rodrigo Duterte has essentially declared war on the press if the press doesn't go along and be compliant with his wishes. So those are three examples of democracies which have been going in the wrong direction in the last few years.
Is there any country you see, I know this sounds maybe over-optimistic given what's going on, but is there any country you've seen which has got marginally better, not just in terms of up and down the rankings, but in real terms, in terms of laws and practices?
I don't want to be a downer on this program, but there aren't that many good examples. Even when countries come out from under the weight of a dictatorship, for example, or like the Soviet Union, there's a brief flourishing of independent journalism. But if the institutions of the state are not there to protect journalists, that's to say, independent courts, fair and independent press regulations in terms of, the granting of broadcast licenses, and if there isn't a respect for rule of law, then journalists can operate, but they can't operate effectively. Russia is a great example of that.
We are talking here about, when you say worse, it's a kind of omnibus catch-all word, but when we talk about worse, it could mean repressive laws, it could mean intimidation, it could mean severe imprisonment, because we know of Turkey, a lot of journalists, I've met a few, who are exiles in Germany and elsewhere. And we are talking journalists being killed. Do you look at them all separately? And are these equally, given equal weightage?
Yeah, for us, the basis from which we do all our work is on human beings. We start with the cases of individual journalists. If one journalist is in jail for doing their job, that's as bad for us as if 40 are in the same country or in jail. So we look at it, each country is specific. They have different ways of intimidating the press and of bringing the press to heel. Some throw journalists in jail. So you could take, for example, the case of Egypt. Before the Arab Spring, there were no cases of journalists in jail in Egypt. The government there had a different way of getting its will imposed on journalists. They used to have what they called the red lines, and journalists, the press, knew where those red lines were. They knew what they could say, they knew what they could broadcast, and they knew what they couldn't. What happened after the Arab Spring was you have essentially now a military dictatorship running Egypt, and there are more than 25 journalists in jail there. So you've gone from 0 to 25. That is their way, the government's way of intimidating the press. In other countries, the way may be a little more subtle. Maybe they don't want the heat of international publicity. Where you have a journalist in jail, you can build a campaign around that individual. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is finding that out at the moment. So they may use a whole network of very repressive laws that tie journalists up in court, in legal proceedings, in expensive defamation trials. And that has a chilling effect on journalists and on journalism, but it doesn't necessarily garner the same international attention because you don't have a poster of a person behind bars. So if you're more subtle, maybe that's how you do it. And then there's tons of other ways of doing it. You can withhold licenses to broadcasters. You can withdraw state advertising from publications so that you're throttling them economically. And, there is the ultimate sanction, which we see, unfortunately, which is you can get journalists killed. There are so many murders around the world that are commissioned by people who don't actually pull the trigger themselves. But, if one journalist is killed, that's a terrible message to everyone else, right?
But one of the things that's happened, many of these, while you were talking about it, I was ticking off boxes about India. One of the things that has happened is the entry of the corporate sector, which also has begun to play an active role by way of pressuring coverage, by way of suits and cases, defamation cases that can tie you up all the time. You're not, for a small organization, The Wire itself has faced several cases. You've got to rush from here to there. It costs money. So harassment, plainly harassment. So the corporate sector's entry now, is that something that has begun to raise red flags in organizations such as yours?
Well, look, the history of the press, particularly in the West and in India, has been one of commercial organizations. And the advertising model served people well for several centuries. You could bring the public to advertisers, and in so doing, you could pay for news. I think that where that works in some of the Western European, North American countries and in India also, that has been a good model, but now that's come apart. And the business underpinnings of the news business have been knocked out by social media advertising companies, Google, Facebook, and the rest. What we have seen, though, is what you get with an authoritarian government is crony capitalism. And the government will use its influence with powerful business owners for them to co-opt their media empires in service of the government. And this can happen anywhere. I'll give you an example of somewhere where it's been really disturbing and which I've been following over the years, which is a European Union member country, which is Hungary. The Prime Minister of Hungary has essentially got his friends in business to bring their media empires and conglomerates behind him and to support him and his Fidesz party in power. So there you see media industry at the service of government. That's deeply disturbing because it freezes out independent news outlets. Advertising in all the press now only puts government advertising, which was an important source of revenue, in news outlets that it regards as sympathetic. And then ordinary citizens, their choice is narrowed because the alternative opinions and alternative news is diminished. There are fewer outlets. That can happen in the EU where there are regulations, laws, and norms. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. And we see it around the world. You see it in those countries that I've already mentioned, such as Turkey and the Philippines, where large outlets behind the government because it's in their interest economically to be so. And if you go against the government, it can cost you on your bottom line.
But there are business houses here which own the media and control it. But they also, even those which don't have any kind of media empire of their own, make sure that the clout of their size, their economic power, their access, just make sure that the media doesn't take too close a look. And often it is, and I use the word very, very carefully, self-censorship, because, and often it is pressure from newspaper management. And my fundamental question still remains, how does one monitor this or use this in any kind of work that organizations such as you or RSF does?
Yeah, this is a complex issue in that if you have a broad range of reporting and a broad range of opinion available to readers, to your audience, then in terms of press freedom, it's fine that a particular publication takes a certain political outlook. It doesn't report the government in a critical light. That's fine if there is this broad menu of options for people. The problem from a press freedom point of view is when that range is narrowed, either through intimidation or through regulatory mechanisms which starve people of income to run news gathering operations, that's when that becomes problematic. So in a country like Turkey, for example, that has happened. There are fewer independent news outlets, whereas 15 years ago, there were lots. They've essentially either been closed down or they've been starved of revenue. And then those big organizations that do continue, there is self-censorship amongst journalists that are working in there. There are editors that say this is not something that we're going to cover, or this is not an opinion piece that we're going to carry. In the world of the United States First Amendment kind of freedom of the press sphere, that's fine. But that's only fine if we as citizens have a choice. If we don't have a choice, then I think that kind of corporate constriction of the space becomes a press freedom issue.
This brings us to India, where many of the issues, many of the concerns that you expressed are being seen over and over again, especially in recent years. You followed India over the years very, very closely, personally, and as an organization. Did you ever see this level of intimidation? More and more journalists are being harassed. There is a fear. Just last 2 weeks ago, 3 or 4 very prominent journalists, along with a member of parliament, were slapped with sedition charges for a misleading tweet, an apparently misleading tweet for which they either deleted or apologized or whatever. And journalists have been killed. Journalists have been, imprisoned. There are cases going on right at this moment. I mean, there is a larger freedom of expression concern, but I'll just stick to journalists for the time being. So tell me about how CPJ has viewed India over the years and what has changed.
Well, what has changed is just in the background is the proliferation of news gathering organizations. I mean, when I worked as a journalist in India, there were very few. There was the big Delhi-based national press, and there were only a few TV channels. Now that's completely changed. So there are far more people in India doing journalism. And that's great. That's a positive development. Indian citizens are far better served by the media now than they were 20, 30 years ago. But with that has come I think a growing intolerance of journalists doing one of their primary roles, which we've already discussed a little, which is holding power to account. And I think for us as an organization, as Committee to Protect Journalists, we are noticing with concern a growing intolerance, particularly on the part of the union government, of journalists doing their work, which is gathering news and disseminating fact-based opinion. India is a vibrant democracy, but India is on some of the lists that we as an organization maintain where you wouldn't expect to see India on those lists. I mean, India is on our impunity list, for example, where we track the murders of journalists where there has been no successful prosecution of the murderers. India is in 12th place on that and has, the last time I looked, 17 unsolved murders of journalists. Impunity is a cancer on journalism. What if journalists can be killed and their killer is not brought to account? That sends a very chilling message to the rest of the journalism community. And India is also on the list that we maintain of journalists in jail. And as of the end of last year, there were 4 journalists in jail in India. Now, that's not a number which is outrageous compared with some of the other countries around the world, but India shouldn't be jailing journalists. I've mentioned Brazil as a bit of an autocratic country. There are no journalists in jail in Brazil. Why are there journalists behind bars in India? These are questions that Indian journalists have to ask themselves and ask the government.
And in fact, they are asking. I mean, one of the things, as you mentioned, Rob, and you were here at a time when the media was very tiny. And curiously, many of the large legacy papers of that time, which you must have read in the mornings, now as compromised as ever. Television channels have thrown in their lot with the government. But at the same time, one heartening factor is that a whole lot of independent journalists, especially digital platforms, because it's somewhat cheaper, have sprung up with different financial and business models, started by journalists, started by small cooperatives, outfits, etc. So yes, there is questioning going on. But collectively, all these sites add to a small percentage of what is out there. The optimistic part is, frankly, and I'm in one of them, the optimistic part is that social media has been a game changer and escalates and amplifies the message. So again, you mentioned some really troubling things like being on the list of countries that jail journalists, the list of countries that are, I mean, impunity is a really strong word here, and growing intolerance. I mean, I know this is a strange thing to ask, but because nobody can really pin it, but how is this sudden slide happen? I mean, we are still a democracy and the courts still function. The readers are free to express their minds. So how did this happen?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question because journalists were being jailed and killed and harassed back in, the 1990s and 2000s. But I think what we have noticed is an intolerance since Prime Minister Modi came to power, that the union government itself is intolerant of what I would call critical and independent scrutiny. And its supporters are too. And you've mentioned harassment a few times. And I think that one of the downsides of social media, and I agree with you that it is overall an incredibly positive force in our profession. But one of the downsides, it allows people to gang up online and attack journalists. And we've seen some terrible instances in India over the years of journalists, particularly female journalists, being mob attacked on Twitter and other platforms by the supporters of the government, right-wing nationalist groups. So that has added to the hostility, the hostile environment in which many journalists are working. And then there's a separate but related issue of the whole Kashmir question, where journalists have been, I would say, sometimes brutally repressed, and some have been killed, some have been jailed, just for trying to bring us the news of what's going on from that state. But the really worrying thing is, in a democracy like India, with a diverse distributed media, because a lot of the journalists that get in trouble are outside of the main metropolitan areas, right? Particularly outside of Delhi and Bombay. So the worrying thing is, who is speaking up for those journalists? Who is looking after them? And if they're in small outfits which don't have deep pockets, it becomes an act of courage sometimes to hold the government and the government's supporters and the ruling party to account.
Before we come to Kashmir, you said that specifically you've seen a certain escalation on social media and elsewhere. I'm sure, and I mean this seriously, I'm sure pointing this out over and over again, the RSF draws up its annual list where India slipped to 142nd position. I'm sure pointing this out over and over again, apart from not making you popular, does it really make a difference with this government, or let's say in the global, power centers, chancelleries, etc.? Does it make a difference? I mean, I'd like to really know whether your voice carries some heft in these matters.
Yes. That question is one, I think, which not just press freedom groups like mine asks itself, but human rights groups and, rights defenders generally are always asking themselves that question, because it can seem hopeless sometimes. If you're trying to affect change in countries, whether it's China or Russia, it seems like you're up against a huge wall of opposition. But I do believe that we make a difference. I believe that by keeping alive the cases of journalists who have been jailed or killed or are being repressed can in the end make a difference. The thing that we find is that governments may not publicly acknowledge that they don't like that we call them out, but in private conversations, in diplomatic exchanges, they are concerned by the fact that their reputation is tarnished and they don't like it. So we keep pushing. Journalists, for example, who are in jail, when they come out of jail, one of the things they say to us and said to me over the years is, thank you for remembering that I was there. It was so encouraging for me to know that I wasn't forgotten, that somebody cared that I was still in jail apart from my immediate family. And we've had instances where journalists have said, because you made such a fuss, little things happened, like my conditions of my jail improved. I got better treatment. They gave me books, or they returned my reading glasses, whatever it was. Tiny, tiny things. But if you're in jail, particularly if you're in solitary confinement, those things can be huge. So that's on the micro level where you're actually trying to help an individual. On the macro level, I think it does make a difference. Believe me, if I didn't think didn't make a difference, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't keep banging my head up against a brick wall. I would go off and do something else. But one of the reasons that I got into this line of work, of advocacy, was that as a journalist over the years, I covered, conflict, war, terrible injustice. And I would write a story, it would go out, and then you'd move on to the next story. And I convinced myself that just by publicizing what was going on, I was going to make a difference. I don't know whether it did. Now, at least, I know that if we take up an issue, whether it's the case of an individual journalist or an issue for a whole group of journalists, we're not going to let it go. We're like a dog with a bone. We're just going to keep at it. And we have had success in getting repressive legislation repealed. We've had success in getting journalists out of jail, and in some cases of getting prosecutions of the murderers of journalists. And I think that if groups like ours in civil society didn't exist, then there would be a huge incentive for governments to do, repressive and liberty-killing measures with no one holding them to account.
Now, speaking up from the other side, as it were, the government of India might, if it listens to this at all, might say that this is all rot. Journalists are free to ask questions. Journalists are free to go about their business. There are so many critical journalists in India. We don't throw everybody in jail. These are specific instances. So largely, it may be able to prove statistically that journalists are free to go about their business, isn't it?
There's always a counter-argument. And look, you're talking about a country, more than 1 billion people, and I'm talking about 4 journalists in jail. But those 4 journalists in jail are nevertheless a stain on the reputation of India as a democracy. Whilst 1 journalist is in jail, then we should not be silent. My problem is that to do your work as a journalist effectively, you need the state to guarantee certain rights and to have institutions that are independent of the executive branch of government to uphold them. So you as a journalist need to have access to public officials who hold public information. We pay officials from the public purse, and so we have to have access to the information that they have so that we know when they're making decisions about our lives, whether they are acting in good faith. We need to be able to hold power to account. Otherwise, the democracy doesn't work. Now, I mean, this may all sound, high-minded and highfalutin to some people, but officials, governments love nothing better than working in the dark. And our job is to be there as a light. And yes, journalists can ask questions, but do they get answers? Do they get real answers? Yes, most journalists can move around. But just look how the government behaves when it feels it's being threatened. Look at the farmers' protests just outside where you are. Look at the way that the press is being treated there. And what's the press doing? It is reporting on a legitimate protest. You may agree with the farmers, you may not agree with the farmers. That's not the issue. The issue is, can journalists in an unhindered way have access to the protests, report on them without being harassed or intimidated by the state? And the answer has been yes, but. And the but has been the attention of journalists or the impeding of journalists doing their work. That shouldn't happen.
Let's come specifically to Kashmir, because Kashmir is a completely different scale of what we are talking about. Kashmiri journalists have always operated in the most difficult conditions. If the state didn't get them, the militants did. And since the removal of Article 370, which is a constitutional guarantee in August of 2018, it's become even worse. The internet was shut off, then slowly the tap was open, and now the internet has been restored. But, journalists have really found it tough to go about their business normally, and then found that the government and the security forces do not give them much leeway. So what have you come across? I know that you've specifically looked at Kashmir, your organization, for the last few months, but what have you found?
Well, I mean, we found that you have, a statewide intimidation of journalists, denial of access to places and to information. You have, we had the imprisonment of the Kashmiri journalist Asif Sultan, who has, been in prison for more than 2 years. We had the killing of the Rising Kashmir journalist, Sidharth Bhatia. So journalists have been jailed or killed for doing their job in Kashmir. And you mentioned the internet shutdown. What a blunt tool to wield, in the 21st century that affects everybody that has an internet connection or a mobile phone. And to do that, to try to control information is an extremely damaging, method. And we see that in much more repressive countries, where they shut down the internet ahead of elections, for example. Just recently in Uganda, in Ethiopia, these countries that use these very damaging tools in an attempt to control the flow of information. So Kashmir is one of those instances where journalists are threatened. It's dangerous. And what's going on when journalists can't report freely from Kashmir? What are we, the public, whether it's the Indian public or the broader international public, what are we not being told? What stories are we not hearing about the suffering of the local population? And I'm not taking a political stance here. I'm just talking about this as a journalist. There is a big story in Kashmir. How are journalists, both national and international, prevented from telling that story, and why are they prevented from telling that story? Those are the big issues that concern me as a press freedom advocate.
And so, I mean, Kashmir certainly, I would say, has been bad consistently and difficult consistently, but it is certainly, I would say, and I'm not from there, but following it as a fellow journalist, it's escalated. And, these are the kind of things in India and in Kashmir. These are the kind of things we used to read about some really repressive regimes in the past. So now with all this, Rob, where do we go? I mean, is there any kind of silver lining? Or is it, I know I'm asking to make predictions, is it going to get worse and worse and worse with so many new laws coming up? Honestly, the digital world is opening up new potential for laws to clamp down on sites. So where do we go from here? Is freedom of the press, as you and I have known it, is over?
No. I mean, look, I don't do forecasts, right? I'm a journalist, not a prophet. And every time I forecast, I get egg on my face. So I'm not making forecasts. Let me just say that one of the silver linings is the proliferation of small, independent news organizations like you at The Wire, like many others. I won't name them because I'll forget somebody and then they'll be upset that I didn't mention them. But there are very many online news sites, portals, new startups in India. And to me, that is a very positive development because that is increasing the range of news and opinion that's available to individuals. One of the things that countries like India have to do now is make sure that there doesn't become a huge digital divide within the population. Those people who have access to broadband and to technology that enables them to enjoy the new digital platforms, and those that don't have smartphones or any phones or bad cell service or whatever, because that is a problem in a lot of countries, the digital divide. But I take the advent of the new technologies as an incredibly positive development for press freedom and journalism. And the fact that governments are scrambling to try to control that, I think, is proof that they realize that these technologies can be dangerous to them if they are what I would say illegitimately hanging on to power. So we have repressive laws trying to curb what is on social media by labeling it fake news or by labeling it as seditious or promotion of terrorists or propaganda. That has been a development which I didn't mention earlier, but we have noticed globally in the last 10 years or so a proliferation of these laws, whether it's in Iran or in the Philippines or all these countries that are trying to control social media. India hasn't gone that far down that road, although there are, you mentioned the word sedition. There are laws, there are proposals for laws to silence journalists by labeling them as sympathetic to terrorists or pushing for terrorist propaganda or promoting fake or false news. So those are some of the things to look out for. But generally, I would say, if you were an Indian citizen in 2021, you are better served as a consumer of news, as someone who wants to get information, than your parents or certainly your grandparents' generation.
Except that, like everything, social media and the digital world has brought with it fake news, which reach much faster than we would ever do to somebody with a phone. And then it becomes, then it becomes virtually the first and last word, after which you're just battling to contradict it maybe, or give perspective or context or whatever. So that is also something. And, it's easy for a government to say we are going to clamp down on fake news and then come down on the genuine sides. So that's another rabbit hole. But fake news, what do you think?
I think fake news is a wonderful slogan for politicians to use to shut us up. We hadn't really heard of fake news a few years ago. Donald Trump took it, threw it at the American media, and then people around the world thought, what a wonderful pretext for me to do just this. Before Donald Trump, it used to be called propaganda, whether it was the Soviet Union or Iran or Saudi Arabia would be saying, these are propagandists and they're not real journalists. Fake news is difficult because what it does is it puts journalists on the back foot. You're then trying to disprove a negative. You're trying to say, no, this isn't fake news, this is real news. So it's not a debate as a journalist that you want to get involved in, because how can you do that? How can you prove that your story is right? Well, the only way you can do that is by continuing to follow up on that story and to get more and more reporting so that the reader or the audience can make up their own mind. Otherwise, what happens is that it delegitimizes the media. It causes people not to believe. And this is the bigger danger as repressive legislation. If you as a government or an individual can undermine the credibility of the media, it doesn't matter how many true stories you put out. It doesn't matter what quality journalism you produce. If nobody believes it, it's all for naught.
Yeah, that's actually reasonably close to my overall opinion that, you can throw it at the converted, all your propaganda, and they are going to stay convinced no matter what you say. I mean, if you were to say day is night and vice versa, they are convinced. But there is an audience out there which even these propaganda websites crave for. They crave for credibility so that they can cross over. And they are never going to get that if they continue spewing up that. So that's an interesting perspective you provided. So clearly, since just touching upon something you said and to use that to kind of end this thing, clearly your voice does carry some weight. The voice of such human rights and journalist rights organization does carry. I prefer to also think of journalist rights in the larger context of freedom of expression and human rights, of course. So if it is carrying weight, then these voices must continue adding to the debate in a big positive way. And certainly in India, often we think that we are a world into ourselves. But there is a world out there which is looking at India. More and more mainstream and prestigious publications are carrying stories about India, and not always positive ones. So I think that is something that will continue along with whatever repressive measures here and other countries continue. So thank you, Rob Mahoney. Thank you for joining us at reasonably short notice and for giving us this fantastic context and background to what has become an extremely essential problem and issue and concern in recent times. Thank you for joining the Wire Talks.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors very quickly this week, thewholetruthfoods.com, Storytel, and CED. We really do appreciate your support. And we had a great week on the network this week. So tune in for some sweetness with our hosts Sadaf and Archit as they hone their sweet tooth and talk about candies. The famous, the healthy, the traditional, and international. Check out Naan Curry. You'll enjoy it. On last week's episode of The Note, Maruk and I spoke to TV presenter and columnist Veer Sanghvi, who analyzed the 2 years of the second term of the Modi government. As China and India signed the disengagement agreement along the LAC, Lieutenant General Dr. Prakash Menon and Manoj Kewalramani joined Suyash Desai to discuss the process and the consequences it will have on the nation and in world politics. Dr. Anton Harder joins Hamsini Hariharan on States of Anarchy to discuss India's right to a seat at the United States Security Council. Ashton Doctor talks about duty, how individually it binds us and how as a society it is liberating. Check out The Habit Coach with Ashton. Every day, great show and great fun to listen to that. On Football Show, to all the boys to talk about their loves and sorrows for teams and their current ranks in the world of football. And also do remember to check out Cyrus Says. We had a great week last week. We had Amol Mazumdar, the ex-cricketer. We had Rocky and Mayur. And we did the Valentine's special with Aisha and Kunal. Great fun. Do check it out. I'm sure you will enjoy that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.